La Niña may be coming to an end this spring. So how could that impact our severe weather season? I'm meteorologist Matt Standridge. Right now, the Climate Prediction Center has an outlook that there's about a 70% chance this weak La Niña that we've been, it's not been too impressive. It's been on the weak side, could be coming to an end. What has this weak La Niña brought for wintertime? Well, across much of the Ohio River Valley, Tennessee River Valley, and along the Gulf Coast, we've seen decent snows, about average or so, maybe just slightly below average for much of the Ohio River Valley, depending on where you are, and then some places a little bit more, so kind of back and forth. The Gulf Coast has had some record snows, but then the northern plains, they haven't had as much, but winter can still bring some snow, and spring can still bring some snow for the northern plains. So now that we're kind of entering slowly into severe weather season with a touch of snow at times, what are we expecting this year? This is not necessarily a detailed forecast on what you can expect this spring, but rather we've looked at all the different springs where we started with the weak La Niña coming out of winter, and then we basically went into what's called an enso-neutral phase. You know, we always talk about La Niña and El Nino, but what if you're in between? Close to an enso-neutral is what we would call that. And so we've looked at all the different times that's happened. But before we really get into it, what is La Niña and what is the neutral phase? It has to do with the surface of the ocean in the eastern Pacific, what its temperature reads at. Is it a little bit below average? Is it a little bit above average? And what we've noticed is that kind of impacts our weather swings here in the continental U.S., kind of impacts where the jet streams are and how those carry different storm systems and who gets something and who really doesn't get much. But in a La Niña phase, this is kind of more of a summertime graphic. Generally, we see this is kind of more talking about hurricanes. With a La Niña phase, we can get more hurricane activity. But what we're talking about is this blue area with the stronger trade winds going from east to west with some of this colder water that we have. So that's La Niña, and it's been a weak one. So the blue is not as impressive if we're going to draw it on a map. But what about enso-neutral? Well, we generally see the trade winds slow down to just average speeds, and then the flip would be true to El Nino, where you've got really, really low speeds. But with just kind of normal trade winds from east to west, we've got near average surface temperatures for the ocean. We're talking about the eastern Pacific, so just off the coast of Ecuador and Peru and there towards Colombia. Just normal. And that also has an influence on our weather as well, and also the tropics, about average activity is what we would typically expect. So this is kind of a way we look at it. This black line here in the middle, that would be average, right there at 0, no change from average. We've been down here towards about negative 0.5 degrees Celsius. So there's not a huge change in the temperature, but we've seen just even little changes can have impacts on our weather. Overall, you got a lot of data here, right? And most of the data is just below that average line. However, once we get to negative 0.4 in the negative category, you know, we call that in the neutral. So kind of in between here is what neutral is. And notice how a lot of the data is getting towards that neutral phase here towards, you know, March, April, May, and June. And these are 3-month averages when you're looking, you got the first letter of the month. So this would be May, June, July. So anyways, we're slowly warming things up, getting closer to average. So that's the forecast. That's what we're thinking. Now, we could have more dips as we get later this year, maybe into the next winter coming up. We're not focused on that. We're focused right here. How could this impact our severe weather season? Well, before we get into it, best way to look is just to see what's happened in the past. So we've looked at years where roughly, give or take, you know, sometimes it's negative 0.7 or negative 0.4, but pretty close. When you start spring, end winter, start spring here, just barely into the La Niña phase, and we start warming things up, getting close to neutral, maybe right there at 0 or maybe negative 0.2, but really close. So these are all the years where we were dead on or really, really close. And so we've looked at all these years and found out, okay, what happened? So just for tornadoes, this is the map. And going forward, what we're going to call this data set will be the guidance years, because they're really guiding our forecast. What has happened in the past? Well, maybe that'll contribute to what happens this year. This is the guidance years all put together of all the tornadoes. You've got the different tracks. You've got different colors. For example, it's hard not to notice this red one. That is the EF4 we had in 2000 and 12 with Henryville. That EF4 that came on through, there was actually over 80 tornadoes just across the region, not just in Indiana, but over several states. So that kind of makes the data a little bit interesting. There's kind of a bump there in that year specifically. But you've got a fairly uniform distribution of these tornadoes. You've got a lot in northern Indiana. In central Indiana, there was my goodness, kind of this highway over these years for southeastern parts of Indianapolis. They're close to New Pal and kind of close to Shelbyville, Greenwood, to Martinsville. And then there's kind of a hole here towards north central Indiana and out towards Purdue and Kokomo. And then you're going to see some counties did not get a tornado in these years at all. Does that mean you won't get a tornado this year? No, but just generally we've noticed that any part of the state does have a chance, but it is kind of interesting how there are a little bit of some holes that we looked at some of this data. Southern Indiana probably has the biggest concentration with some of the stronger ones. You know, when you're looking at these light blues and greens, we're talking about EF0s and EF1s, but once you get to the yellows and oranges and reds, you get some stronger tornadoes. So maybe a slight southerly tilt to some of the stronger tornado data. We'll see. But really we're looking at the count. And so everything that we are going with moving forward is for the entire state of Indiana, not necessary for a Pacific region, but this is what we would normally predict throughout the spring. In March, on average, this is looking back over the past 40 years specifically. Depending on what your kind of time range is, you might get a slightly different number, but over the past 40 years or so, we generally in March get 2 to 3 tornadoes in Indiana, 3 to 4 in April, 5 in May, and 5 in June. So those are the 4 months that are our biggest tornado months usually. There is also a little bit more of a severe weather peak there in the fall too, but here in the spring, the main severe weather peak, those are the 4 months. When we looked at the guidance years, remember those are the ones where we started with that very weak La Niña, went to Enzo neutral, we kind of noticed something interesting. The first part of the spring actually was pretty active. Look there in April, when we averaged all the guidance years out, we were getting 8 to 9 tornadoes across the state. That's actually a pretty big jump. So when you're just looking at this wholesale for a second, it seems like early spring in the guidance years, we're more active. May kind of mellowed things out. I mean, May is a big month, one of our biggest months, but went back to more average, and then June kind of wrapped things up pretty quickly. So you could probably say, just looking at these guidance years, we may have an uptick in tornadoes, but really at the front end, and then things may kind of collapse a little bit faster. We'll see if that takes place this year, but that's what we learned. Then we're going to move to hail, and if you look, whole state easily gets hail. There's really not any kind of sign on when you're looking, okay, this part of the state gets more, that or less. And you got different colors, you know, some of these little white ones and light blue ones, smaller hail. Once you get some of the green ones, we've got some bigger hail that could be over 2 inches. Those are the really damaging hail. But usually we don't get hail reports until they've reached about a quarter size. Those are the times when we actually start getting damage. Little baby hail usually doesn't do too much harm. You know, that kind of pea-sized hail. You'll hear it, but usually not too damaging. So those are all the hail reports that we've compiled over just the guidance years. And so when we're going to look at these reports, let's start with how many times do we get reports? And I will tell you, when it comes to hail and wind, these reports are really tough because you can have one big hailstorm that, let's say, hits Bloomington, dumps some hail, but then moves up the 69 corridor, then hits Martinsville, and then comes into southwest side of Indianapolis and hits Indy. You're going to have multiple reports, most likely, even though it's the same storm. But in a way, you've got several different areas of damage. So reports can get kind of wonky, but just stick with me. On average, we get 44 reports in April, 52 in May, 40 in June. Now notice the months are kind of delayed a little bit. In order to get really good hail, you need some really warm temperatures at the ground to help support the buoyancy in the clouds. You need enough lift, you need enough energy, enough temperature to keep the hailstones up, to carry them, to get them bigger and bigger until eventually the sky can't hold them any longer, and then you drop these ice chunks to the ground. So you're going to notice a little bit more of a later tilt for hail specifically, but still cold enough in the upper levels that you have the formation of hailstones. So that's what we typically get, a good amount of hail here in Indiana. It gets even worse once you head out towards the western plains. These are the guidance years. We actually noticed a pretty big uptick in April. Remember, April also had some more of those tornadoes. April could, on average for these guidance months, seems to be a pretty busy month around here. 72% increase. May's pretty much a wash, and then June maybe a little bit more as well. But kind of front loading April, may be the bigger month, where on average, when you're just going off the reports that people send in, not necessarily the number of hail storms that we have. We don't really have data on just the exact number of hail storms. We don't count them kind of like that in that way. We count more damage. But May would be your bigger month. So maybe more hail, especially in April. We'll have to see. Winds kind of the same way. Everyone gets hail. When you get the deeper blue colors, the bigger blue colors too, when the size of the outcome gets bigger, those are your bigger wind gusts. We typically get these wind damage reports once you get close to about 60 miles per hour for some of these gusts, but we can easily get up to 100 miles per hour with some of these stronger storms. On average, we get 68 reports of damaging wind in May, 100 in June. That's the big month. July is right behind that. Usually for wind, you even need more heat to kind of fuel these massive windstorms. A lot of times these windstorms feed off of the extra heat of the air, but also the humidity of our crop fields. Yeah. And so you guys know, June and July, our crops are getting bigger. By July, knee high before 4th of July. Sometimes they're way hotter than that, depending on when they planted. But those are the months to really watch. Notice on the guidance, we actually had a little bit of a dip. Nothing crazy, but a little bit of a dip in the wind damage reports. Will we see that this year? I don't know. But maybe that could be the case. What is probably the most convincing data, though, comes to rainfall. You're thinking, man, I don't care about rainfall. You want to talk about severe weather? Well, guess what? Flooding is the #2 killer from a weather perspective in the U.S. Yeah, flooding's a big deal. And flooding is a big deal for our economy too when it comes to the spring. We've really noticed a lot of rain in these springs, and sometimes a lot more than normal. And then sometimes our summers have gotten just really dry overall. And so hopefully you got enough water to kind of hold things out throughout the rest of the summer. You'll get these downpours throughout the summer, but they're super hit or miss. So when it comes to rain, we actually had a call with the National Weather Service about some severe weather things, and they touched mostly just on rainfall. And we've noticed that when you look at these guidance years, we get more rainfall is what it looks like when you go from weak La Nina to an ENSO neutral. On average, we're getting about 4 to 5 inches. But then when we averaged out the guidance years, wetter in northern Indiana, pretty much really wetter there in central Indiana, and really wetter in southern Indiana. And we've noticed, and that's what they said too, the National Weather Service call, is that they're actually concerned about flooding for southern Indiana. A lot of these crops, when we're talking about spring, right? Get warm enough, farmers want to get out and do their thing, right? Start planting. But in a forecast like this, you have to watch out because we get these big downpours, or you just get rainier patterns overall. You get these flooding of the cornfields and soybean fields, and the problem is, a couple of different problems actually. Just one problem, for example, would be the washing away of the nutrients, and then another one, if the crops were starting to grow, and then you guys seen it, when a big flooding event takes place, or even these big ponding events, you kill a lot of the crops too. So that gets really tough. So something that farmers will be watching this year could be the increased chance of rain, especially for central and southern Indiana. Some of the rivers could be a little bit higher, and you may notice drainage ditches also running just a little bit heavier throughout the spring. So this includes March, April, May, and June. Once again, National Weather Service is kind of thinking rainfall is their biggest thing on their threat level this year. You always don't think about it. Not everyone's impacted the same way, but some of us who are could really see a doozy of a year. About 2.4 inches on average for central Indiana, and the highest was in southeastern Indiana. They're from the Louisville suburbs, the northern suburbs, and then once you get towards Madison and then towards Cincinnati. So when you add that to the average, we're talking about 6, 7, 8 inches. And there were some years, I should say this, that's an average. 7 out of those 9 years had above average rainfall. 2 of them did not. So we could have something like that this year. We'll have to see. But in some of those years, we got 5, 6, 7, 8, or 9 inches more in some of those regions. If we get something like that, that could be kind of disastrous for some of our crop fields. So we'll be watching that closely. So we put everything together. Here is, I guess you could call our severe weather outlook for Indiana for spring 2025. Once again, we don't know what's going to happen. We'll be forecasting event by event, but when we do look at these past years across the entire state, not necessarily for a certain section, we do notice some of these increases or decreases. Now notice I've got the increases in red because we don't like them, right? Otherwise, you don't really think going up, you think green. So just work with me here. Red, bad, right? They're going up. Green, going down. Threat level going down maybe a little bit. That's a good thing. We don't want this. It's also been, expensive year for insurance. And so even when big events take place across the country, all these insurance companies pull money in. So it actually increases our rates too, even if we don't get a lot. So we're just hoping we don't get a lot. But in tornadoes, there could be a slight increase. especially the early part of spring. One piece of good news I have about tornadoes, though, for the entire year, we actually get fewer tornadoes in this kind of setup. It's just really kind of bullseyed there for March and really into April. And so we'll watch that for tornadoes, but the rest of the year seems really quiet. Hopefully the whole year's quiet. Hail, kind of a big increase, especially remember there in April. We'll watch out for possibly more hail reports. Wind, maybe a little bit lower, hopefully. Flooding, though, and we're on board with the National Weather Service on this one. Maybe a higher threat this year. So we'll see what comes our way. Our weather team is focused on the next 7 to 10 days. And then once the storm system gets really close, we'll really kind of hone in on the impacts and the details about 3 days out. We're going to be there with you for every system that comes on through. We do expect it to be an active spring. Hopefully this gives you maybe a little bit of background information on what we've seen in the past. But we'll have to see what Indiana throws at us this year for spring 2025.